welcome to this session of EduSet. As already announced, today we are going to discuss religious policy of Akbar. As a student of history and especially of Mughal India, this will be relevant for you who are enrolled in the course for EHI 4, that is on Mughal history, which is part of bachelor's degree program of the university. As you have already studied in your course that Mughals ruled more than 200 years in India, and it was a centralized administrative structure which governed the whole of the country during this period. As far as religious policy of Mughal emperors is concerned, it has been a topic of debate and discussion among historians for quite some time. There have been heated debates about what was the attitude of the Mughal emperors about the state affairs and how were they, whether they were using religion or were they dictated by the religious beliefs of their religious belief while deciding the policies of the state. What we intend to do today is we are going to pick some key issues in the areas of Mughal state's attitude towards religion, and especially we'll go into much more detail specifically about Akbar and his policy. The major issues which we will touch upon today is, first and foremost, is how far the state policies were dictated by the religious considerations. Within that we'll talk about the taxation system, specifically within that jizya, which has been a matter of debate among scholars, how far it was important, whether it was there, when it was there, why it was there, and what was its overall impact. Similarly, appointments, administrative controls, attitude towards subjugated territories and relationships with them, were their religion any part of that? So that is one aspect in administrative attitude and policies. Second would be the personal belief of the emperor, individual emperor, and whether it had any role in state policies or not. Third, whether in dealing with the subjects, that is general population, whether state or individual emperors were having any consideration or discrimination on the basis of religion in dealing specific issues of state. Fourthly, we will talk about specifically in detail about Akbar's experiments and a number of policies and number of initiatives taken by Akbar, how far they have been responsible in shaping his religious policy, and what are the debates which has consumed historians for quite some time. And in this category we will talk about mainly four things, that is about Ibadat Khana and discussions taking place in Ibadat Khana among Muslim scholars, and when Ibadat Khana is open for people and religious leaders of different religions prevalent in India. Second would be about Mahzar, which was one of the important documents issued during the reign of Akbar, and how it has taken shape among the scholars and how they have debated on this. Third would be about Sulh-e-Kul and Deen-e-Ilahi, the two initiatives taken by Akbar and how far Akbar succeeded in them, or what was the impact of these initiatives on the society of that period. Fortunately for all of us, we have with us two eminent experts. One, Professor S.M. Azizuddin Hussain. Professor Aziz is one of the very senior professors. He is in Jamia Millia Islamia University. He has worked extensively in the area of medieval India, specifically Mughal policies, and he has studied in detail the religious policies also, not only of Akbar but also Aurangzeb and their different approaches and attitudes towards the state policies. So we'll greatly benefit from his presence, I'm sure. Second expert with us is Professor Ravind Kumar. He's a professor of history and specialized in Mughal Indian art and architecture. With his vast experience in the area of art, architecture, painting, literature, and other cultural aspects of the Mughal India, we would benefit from the discussions with him how far these areas were influenced by the religious attitudes and policies of the Mughal emperors. So I'll start with Professor Aziz, and I'll request Professor Aziz to give his initial comments about how does he see Akbar's religious policy and its various facets. Thank you.
Now, as far as Akbar's religious policy is concerned, so you find that neither the Delhi Sultanate nor the Mughal Empire was a theocratic state. But basically they followed both the Delhi Sultans as well as the Mughal emperors, the Hanafi fiqh, and that was restricted only to judicial matters. Now, as far as revenue is concerned, so the restriction of the Sharia was that the state can only levy up to 1/2 of the total produce from the peasants, and that is all. Rest of the things were decided by the rules and regulations framed during the Sultanate period and during the period of the Mughals, especially during the period of Akbar.
Professor Aziz, I would request you to clarify to our students what do we actually mean by theocratic state. When we are saying that Mughal state was not theocratic, dharm kendrit या धर्म आधारित नहीं थी, तो उससे क्या मतलब है हमारा, किसको हम धर्म आधारित कहेंगे? क्या जनरल तौर पे लोग मानते हैं कि अगर रूलर मुस्लिम धर्म का है तो अपने आप स्टेट भी क्या धर्म केंद्रित है?
इसका बेसिक डिफरेंस ये था कि इस्लामिक स्टेट जो है वो हेरिडिटरी नहीं होगी, उसमें किंगशिप नहीं होगी. किंगशिप अन इस्लामिक इंस्टीट्यूशन है. तो चाहे वो दिल्ली सल्तनत हो या मुग़ल एम्पायर हो, ये दोनों नेचर में अन इस्लामिक गवर्नमेंट है और इनका जो पूरा कैरेक्टर है उसका इस्लाम से कोई ताल्लुक़ नहीं है. इनका सिर्फ एक ज्वाइंटिंग फोर्स ये है कि दे वर मुस्लिम्स, लेकिन इनका मुसलमान होना इस बात की दलील नहीं हो सकता कि ये स्टेट भी इस्लामिक स्टेट थी. इसीलिए हिस्टोरियंस का कहना ये है कि ये दोनों स्टेट जो हैं वो थियोक्रेटिक स्टेट्स नहीं थी.
अजीज साहब, आप बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट स्टेटमेंट दे रहे हैं और मैं समझता हूँ कि स्टूडेंट्स को ये बात ठीक से समझनी चाहिए कि सिर्फ रूलर का मुसलमान होना ही किसी स्टेट को थियोक्रेटिक स्टेट नहीं बना देता. थियोक्रेटिक स्टेट का मतलब है कि तमाम, मान लीजिए इस्लामिक थियोक्रेटिक स्टेट हम कहें दिल्ली सल्तनत को और मुग़ल एम्पायर को, तो उसका मतलब यह है कि इस्लाम के तमाम कायदे कानून उन तमाम लोगों पर लागू होंगे जो उस स्टेट में रह रहे हैं. उस सेंस में अजीज साहब एक बढ़िया स्टेटमेंट दे रहे हैं कि ना तो दिल्ली सल्तनत और ना ही मुग़ल एम्पायर थियोक्रेटिक स्टेट थे, क्योंकि वो अन इस्लामिक प्रिंसिपल्स पर बेस्ड थे. इस्लाम के जो स्ट्रिक्ट फॉर्मुलेशंस हैं स्टेट को चलाने के, वो इन दोनों स्टेट्स पर लागू नहीं होते. तो मैं समझता हूँ कि रिलीजियस पॉलिसी का डिस्कशन इस बैकग्राउंड में बहुत सिग्निफिकेंट हो जाता है.
इस्लाम बेसिकली जागीरदाराना और ज़मींदाराना निज़ाम को डिरिकॉग्नाइज करता है कि जागीरदाराना और ज़मींदाराना जो निज़ाम है उसमें इस्लाम एक्सेप्ट ही नहीं करता उसको. तो ये बेसिक डिफरेंस है. और चाहे सल्तनत हो उसमें इख्ता सिस्टम है, इसमें जागीरदाराना निज़ाम है, ज़मींदाराना निज़ाम है जिसका इस्लाम से कोई ताल्लुक़ नहीं है. उसमें ज़मींदार नाम की इस्लाम में कोई चीज़ है ही नहीं.
Then Professor Aziz, then why is it that we keep reading by various contemporary scholars and later on historians have been debating whether jizya was imposed by certain of these sultans, which is in definition a religious tax. So, and what was the case of Akbar, whether he was also following the jizya, and what was his attitude towards jizya, if it was not a theocratic state.
इसमें एक बात तो ये साफ कर दूं कि जजिया इस्लाम के राइज के बाद शुरू नहीं हुआ, बल्कि प्री इस्लामिक अरेबिया में ही गजीद था, जिसका बाद में जजिया प्रोनाउंसिएशन बनाया गया. और इसका जो मकसद था, जो प्रॉफिट ने मदीना में स्टेट बनाई 622 AD में, तो वो स्टेट जो थी उसमें क्रिश्चियंस, जूस, پیگنس اور مسلمان سب شامل تھے، لیکن آرمی جو تھی وہ صرف مسلمانوں کی ہوگی. تو اس کے لیے میں جو پروٹیکشن آف لائف اور پروٹیکشن آف پراپرٹی اور ایگزیمپشن فرام آرمی سروس جو نان مسلمس کو اسلامک اسٹیٹ نے پرووائڈ کیا، اس کے لیے میں اسلامک اسٹیٹ نے 622 سے 661 تک جزیہ لیا. تو وہ ایک ایگزیمپشن کا ٹیکس تھا کہ اگر آپ آرمی ٹیکس نہیں دے رہے، اگر آپ آرمی جوائن نہیں کر رہے تو کوئی ٹیکس آپ اسٹیٹ کو دیجیے، کیونکہ وہ آرمی جو ہے آپ کو پروٹیکشن آف لائف اور پروٹیکشن آف پراپرٹی پرووائڈ کر رہی ہے. صرف اس کا مقصد یہ تھا، اس کا مقصد کوئی ریلیجن سے نہیں تھا. دوسری چیز یہ ہے کہ جزیہ جب ہندوستان میں آتا ہے تو ہندوستان میں تو چاہے وہ فیروز شاہ تغلق ہوں یا وہ اکبر ہوں یا اور کوئی بھی مغل ایمپرر ہو، اورنگزیب ہو، ان میں سے کسی ایک کو جزیہ لگانے کا حق اس لیے نہیں تھا کہ ان کی جو نیچر آف اسٹیٹ تھا وہ ان اسلامک تھا. تو جزیہ لگانے کا تو حق اس کو ہوگا کہ جس کا نیچر آف اسٹیٹ اسلامک ہو. جیسے آج ایران میں ہے اسلامی جمہوریہ، تو ایران میں تو اسلامی جمہوریہ کو جزیہ لینے کا رائٹ ہے، لیکن 79 کے بعد سے ایران بھی نان مسلم سے جزیہ نہیں لے رہا. تو یعنی اسلامک اسٹیٹ ہونے کے باوجود، جبکہ فیروز شاہ ہیریڈیٹری سلطان تھا، اورنگزیب ہیریڈیٹری سلطان تھا، ایمپرر تھا، تو ان کو تو جزیہ لگانے کا اسلام خود ہی حق نہیں دیتا. اچھا، دوسری چیز یہ ہے کہ جزیہ، جیسے امام غزالی نے لکھا ہے کہ جزیہ جو اسلام میں تھا وہ بہت ہی انصاف کے اس پہ تھا، بیسس پہ. اور 11 سینچری کے وہ اسکالر ہیں، انہوں نے کہا کہ آج جس ظلم کے ساتھ جزیہ لیا جا رہا ہے تو جزیہ لینا ہی ناجائز و حرام ہے. اور بنی امیہ کے زمانے میں اس میں ایک اور ہوا 661 AD کے بعد کہ مسلمانوں سے جزیہ لیا گیا. یعنی بنی امیہ نے کہا کہ اگر مسلمان ہوتے رہیں گے تو جزیہ تو ختم ہو جائے گا، تو ہماری اسٹیٹ کی انکم ختم ہو جائے گی. تو انہوں نے کہا کہ اب اگر آج آپ مسلمان ہوتے ہیں تو آپ اپنے بہاف پہ ہوئیے، اسٹیٹ آپ کو خراج اور جزیے سے ایگزیمپشن نہیں دے گی. انہی تمام چیزوں کو سامنے رکھتے ہوئے میں سمجھتا ہوں، کیونکہ اکبر پہلا اسکالرلی سلطان بادشاہ ہے مغل جس نے اس کے بارے میں سوچا، اور اس نے سوچا کہ مغل امپائر کو کوئی رائٹ نہیں ہے. اور جو جسٹیفیکیشن ابو الفضل نے اکبر نامے میں دی ہے وہ یہی ہے کہ آج ہمیں جزیہ کلیکٹ کرنے کی قطعی ضرورت نہیں ہے. اسٹیٹ کے پاس اتنی دولت ہے، تمام چیزیں اسٹیٹ کے پاس موجود ہیں، اور ہمارے پاس اتنی دولت ہے کہ ہم دوسروں کو بانٹ سکتے ہیں. تو اکبر نے 1564 میں جزیہ معاف کر دیا، اور اسی کو اپریشیٹ کرتے ہوئے لوگوں نے اکبر کو اپریشیٹ کیا، نان مسلمس نے اکبر کو اپریشیٹ کیا، اور وہ پھر مغل امپائر کے قریب ہوتے چلے گئے.
What you mean to say, Professor Aziz, is there was no discrimination in collecting taxes from the peasants, whether they belong to Hinduism or they belong to Muslims.
No.
So there was no discrimination in any sort of tax collection.
No discrimination.
Yes. And he's also making another very important point. We must all understand that the concept of jizya, as it originated during the time of Prophet Muhammad, was very different from the way in which it was imposed during the Sultanate period in India.
By some sultans.
By some sultans. And it did not have the same kind of religious sanction or the sanction of the law as was the case in the Arabic land under Prophet Muhammad. Therefore, when we talk about jizya in the context of India, we should be a little more careful. We should be able to understand the exact connotation in which jizya was imposed. And when he says that Akbar did not impose jizya or abolish jizya because the state revenues were full, there was no problem of money at that point of time, he is making a very significant point, because jizya as a tax and supporting a state is no more a consideration under the rule of Akbar. So this, I believe, is a very significant departure from the general understanding of jizya.
So
now there is one point also which I have also pointed out in my book, Structure of Politics under Aurangzeb, that when Aurangzeb reimposed jizya in 1679, so there was no justification, because 31% Hindus were serving in his army. So what was the justification? Islam said that the exemption will be given from the army service. Aurangzeb was taking army service from Hindus and also reimposed jizya. So it has no justification. But because we interpret all these things, because it was implemented by Firoz Shah Tughlaq and Aurangzeb, and we do not study Islam, that is why we commit, that is why these historians like Jaduna Sarkar and others, Sri Ram Sharma, they have committed blunders and they couldn't interpret jizya in the proper form.
That's right. They have given one particular image of jizya, as if abolition of jizya is a progressive step and reimposition of jizya is a step in tune with Islam, whereas the fact is that it is not in tune with Islam.
And what about other areas of state policy? Akbar's state policy, whether there was any impact on his state policy of his religious beliefs in appointments, in recruitments, or in relationship with his subordinate general people, because the majority, of course, was non-Muslim, while the ruler and a small group of ruling groups came from the Islamic background. So what was Akbar's net attitude towards other matters of state? If jizya is one thing, you said that he did not follow any discrimination, but other appointments or his officers and his conquests after that settlement with victorious people, say he conquered large areas of Rajputana and large number of kingdoms which were under Rajputs or other Hindu kings. What was his attitude as a emperor with them?
Now, as far as Akbar's policy is concerned, it starts from 1564, and that shows that he was very liberal, and he adopted a liberal policy, and that was also welcomed by the Rajputs, and that is why we find that Akbar also made matrimonial alliances with the Rajput Rajas, and there was no question of any problem between their relationship, and as well as we find he did not follow any discriminatory policy, and as far as all rules and regulations are concerned, all taxation policies are concerned, they were all uniform. He did not adopt any discriminatory. For example, he gave the mansab of 5,000 Zat and 5,000 Sawar to Raja Man Singh. So that shows that he was totally liberal, and Akbar's liberalism is also reflected from Vrindavan, because he basically built up two pilgrim centers. One was Vrindavan and another was Ajmer. One was for Muslims, another was for Hindus. Because as far as the sources which I have read, I never come across any reference about Vrindavan in the sources of Sultanate. The emergence of Vrindavan comes only from the period of Akbar. He gave land grants to the temples, and only after Akbar gave land grants to the temples of Vrindavan, Raja Man Singh built up a beautiful temple in Vrindavan, and again we find and then he also abolished pilgrimage tax, so that pilgrims can come and go without paying any tax. So the abolition of pilgrimage tax was basically Akbar's policy, which indicated freedom of religion, that now you are free, you can go anywhere for pilgrimage. Otherwise there was restriction that the rich Hindus can come to Vrindavan and to pay their pilgrimage. The poor Hindus can't go to Vrindavan, but Akbar abolished pilgrimage tax and made Vrindavan open to all. So this shows the freedom of religion, because naturally it was 16th century. He can't issue a charter of freedom of religion, but the abolition of pilgrimage tax, abolition of jizya were basically the part and parcel of the charter of freedom of religion.
Thank you, Professor Aziz. That brings me to Professor Raveen. I would like to request him to say what about his policy in the areas of art and culture. Say Akbar's architecture, his paintings, music during his period, and literature. Was there any? What sort of religious attitude was it visible in any of these areas of culture and all?
Yeah, it is true, and I quite agree with what Professor Azizuddin Hussain has said. Islamic ruler of the country. He is an emperor of Hindustan. He is not a Muslim emperor of Hindustan. And that is why we get to see these significant measures. One is the abolition of pilgrim tax. The second is the abolition of jizya. The third is the induction of a large number of non-Muslim
Nobles and officers.
these zamindars into his nobility, people of eminence. And Akbar's nobility, we all know, was composed of a heterogeneous element. They were not only Muslims, there were a large number of non-Muslim elements also. As has been pointed out by him, Raja Man Singh was bestowed with such a high mansab as 5,000 Zat and 5,000 Sawar. During the time of Akbar, I believe 5,000 was a very big mansab. This attitude of Akbar, this Catholicity of Akbar, is amply reflected in the general social field, which Professor Khan has rightly dubbed as the area of art and culture, the area of literature, the area of people-to-people contact, the area of interpersonal relationships. This Catholicity is amply reflected there. And I will give you some interesting examples which will establish the point which Professor Azizuddin Hussain has already made. The foremost and the most visible is the impact on architecture. We all know that in the field of architecture, a new technology was brought by the early Turkish sultans, and that technology was the technology of arch making, which had replaced the then prevalent technology called the corbel and beam technology. But in Akbar's architecture, we see a wonderful amalgamation, a wonderful mix of arch and corbel and beam technology. In other words, in simple words, you can say that in Akbari architecture, you get to see the foreign elements, that is Islamic, if you want to call it Islamic elements, the Turkish elements, and the local indigenous elements, the Hindu elements. And the most wonderful example of this kind of amalgamation is to be seen in the capital that he set up at Fatehpur Sikri. The first glance, if you travel in an aeroplane and you look at Fatehpur Sikri, it will be difficult for you, very difficult for you, and I reiterate, it will be very difficult for you to identify that town either as a Muslim town or as a Hindu town. It is neither a Muslim town nor a Hindu town. Frankly speaking, the first impression that you gather at looking at this town from an aeroplane is a kind of a town where the two kinds of architectural elements are beautifully intermixed. Arch is used where large openings are needed. Corbel and lintel beam structure is used where closed spaces are needed. Economy of architecture is needed. Not much money is to be spent, and the beauty of carving and using bracket, etc., is to be achieved. Then these kind of things are to be used. Now, it is quite evident that Akbar was very, very clear in his mind that he was ruling Hindustan. He was not ruling either Muslims or Hindus, and therefore was free and was willing to accept influences locally available from different regions of the country. The other important aspect of Fatehpur Sikri architecture is that elements from the regional architectural traditions such as Gujarat, such as Bengal, such as Rajasthan are amply reflected in the, when we discuss architecture at some other point of time, then I should be able to show you all these. But at this point, it is important to remember that Akbari architecture is reflective of a pan-Indian architecture. It is neither Islamic architecture nor predominantly Hindu architecture. So I answer Professor Khan's first query with respect to architecture. The Catholicity is the word, an amalgamation, a mix of all the available elements. And another important point in the field of literature, it is interesting for us to note that Hindi literature produces one of the best specimens of its kind during the rule of Akbar. Goswami Tulsidas was a poet who lived during the time of Akbar. Abdul Rahim Khane Khana's couplets, we all know, we are all familiar. When I was a student, I was reading Rahim ke Dohe in most of the textbooks. It is an interesting fact that Rahim ke Dohe are easily remembered. They are in the local dialect. They are not in Persian. They are in Hinduvi. They are in local dialect, and they are very easy for any one of us to remember. So that is how we look at the Akbar's attitude towards culture, towards architecture, towards literature in general.
Thank you, Rahim. initiatives by Akbar, which are very important initiatives, which were probably for the first time that they were taken up in Indian history, where religion becomes a point of discussion between different communities, a dialogue is established, and there is an honest effort to understand what different religions hold. And that was the experiment of Ibadat Khana, and then subsequently his policy of Sulaykul. So I will request Professor Aziz to talk something about what was this Ibadat Khana and what was the purpose behind it and what were the debates taking place there.
So basically Akbar was thinking on all those points. So he came to a conclusion that he should lay down the foundation of some center, which he named as Ibadat Khana, and which was started in 1575. So in 1575, the discussion was only allowed among Sunni ulama only. But in 1576, he invited the Shi'i ulama also. Now it was a major step of Akbar, because from the foundation of Delhi Sultanate till 1576, the Shi'i ulama were not allowed to say anything with full freedom.
So this is an important
yes,
point.
Yes. And
as he said in the beginning, only
yes,
Hanafi fiqh was dominating
yes,
the
yes,
scene.
yes, yes. And he invited, and that basically the Sunni ulama got annoyed that they were of the view like Barni. Barni writes in his Tarikh al-Roshai that the Sultanate is only for Sunnis, and all the non-Sunnis should be ousted from Sultanate, and they should not be given any position in the Sultanate.
From that level of
From that
intolerance
level,
now,
yes. Now Akbar is inviting Shi'i ulama in the Ibadat Khana in 1576. Now that basically created a challenge for the Sunni ulama. And if you just see a painting of Ibadat Khana, which is preserved in National Museum, on which Archaeological Survey of India had also done their excavation in Fatehpur Sikri, and also located that Ibadat Khana. So on one platform the ulama were sitting, then some senior nobles were sitting, then Abul Fal and some Christian missionaries were sitting, and on the top Akbar was sitting. Now this was a challenge. Now Badayuni, who is a contemporary of Akbar, he writes in Muntakhab al-Tawarikh that in these discussions which were taking place from the Thursday evening up to Friday morning, so in these discussions the Shi'i ulama used to emerge as successful and Sunni ulama were defeated. So this is the statement of a Sunni alim. Then in 1578 Akbar also invited Hindus, Brahmins, non-Muslims,
Jains,
Brahmins, Jains, Buddhists, Christians and all. And then we find that Badayuni is speaking against Akbar that what he is doing, and he is even inviting the Kafirs in the Ibadat Khana, and the discussions had taken place. And now this was basically the beginning of for foundation of the policy of Sulaykul, that how Akbar will make the model of his policy of Sulaykul, because simultaneously he had also established the Darut Tarjuma, the Department of Translation. If you visit the Fatehpur Sikri, so just as adjacent to Ibadat Khana, you will find a small building which was called as Darut Tarjuma, or the Department of Translation. So Akbar first of all had assigned the task of the translation of Bible and Ramayana and Mahabharata, because Akbar wanted to know what is written in these religions, because they were unaware. Muslims were ruling India from 13th century, but they were totally unaware of their own beliefs. So Akbar arranged the translation of Bible and Ramayana and Mahabharata, and one assignment was also given to Abdul Qadir Badayuni, that he had to translate Ramayana. But he translated, but he did not mention the names of such as Ram and Krishna and so that, and those gaps were filled up some other person. So this was another step that to understand that how to understand the Indic religions, where they were ruling. So this shows Akbar's consciousness, because if you are going to follow a policy towards Hindus, so you are totally ignorant of their beliefs. So this was the second step after Ibadat Khana, the Tarut Tarjuma.
But Professor Aziz, what was these discussions of Ibadat Khana were leading to? Were they just for intellectual interest, or were they having any impact on the policies also?
No, basically Akbar wanted to know that what are the differences and what is their ultimate goal. So Akbar realized that whether they are Sunnis, whether they are the Shiis, whether they are Brahmins,
Jains,
Christians
Parsis.
or Buddhists or whatever, they are basically talking for one person. And that we find when Dara Shikoh translated the Upanishads. So when he translated the Upanishad into Persian, so instead of writing Bismillah Rahman Rahim or Om or anything, he starts the first line that I start the Sri Akbar with the name which has no name. With whatever name you call him, he listens.
Oh, this is very
Yes,
interesting.
he
This I think
listens.
is a very
So
significant.
this was realized by Akbar, and later on it was translated by his great grandson Dara Shikoh in the translation of Sirri Akbar. So basically Akbar was thinking that there is only one authority which rules everyone, whether he is a Hindu, whether he is a Christian, whether he is a Muslim, whether he is a Sunni, whether he is a Shia.
So you were talking about all these were leading. Next step was Sulhekul.
Yes.
So we would like to know what this Sulhekul was,
Yes, yes.
and what was its importance.
So before Sulhekul, Sheikh Mubarak thought that he should also draft a measure, which he drafted in 1579. And naturally, he must have also consulted Akbar, because historians differ that Akbar was illiterate and he didn't know anything. But I don't accept this thesis of the historians. Akbar was well read and he knew everything. Otherwise, he can't establish centers like Vrindavan, centers like Ajmer, centers like Ibadat Khana, and centers like Darut Tarjuma, because a well-read person, a scholarly person, must have taken such decisions. And illiterate, we can't expect
Well,
these
the
steps.
vision
from-
shows that
Yes,
he-
yes, yes. So, historians say that Sheikh Mubarak has no right to draft anything. He
Without
must-
the authority.
Yes, without the authority of Akbar. So he must have consulted Akbar, and only after his consultation, he drafted the measure in which 6 ulama, including Sheikh Mubarak, signed. And in that uh, measure, they declared as Sultan Adil as well as Mustahid.
They declared Akbar.
Yes, they declared Akbar as Sultan Adil and Mustahid.
What does that mean?
Yes, but most of the historians from R.P. Tripathi, Nurul Hassan, Adar Abbas Rizvi, Israr Alam Khan, and other historians, here Shiva, they all write Imam Adil. The text of measure says that he declared as Sultan Adil, and then he declared Akbar as Mustahid. Now, among Sunnis, after the completion of the 4 schools of thought, that is Imam Shafi, Imam Hanafi, Imam Malik, Imam Hanbal, the gate of Ijtihad was closed, and there will be no Mustahid, because they said that now nobody can interpret Islam. Now, this is very significant that these 6 persons declaring Akbar as Mustahid, it means that they were reviving the Ijtihad in Islam, which was closed in 7th and 8th century AD. So this is a significant step.
And then the main purpose was that Islam should move along with time.
Yes, yes,
It
yes.
cannot be stationary
Yes,
at one
yes,
stage.
yes, yes. So if Akbar is taking steps, so he must be free because he is a mustahid. So in that measure, it was declared that if there will be difference of opinion among the ulama or on interpretation, so that will be submitted to Akbar, and whatever decision will be taken by Akbar, that will be the final. Now you just see that as historians said that he was ignorant. Now a decision taken by ulama and they are having differences. How an ignorant
Person can
emperor
take decision.
can take a final decision? So this is another step which shows that Akbar was a well-led person and even more scholarly than the ulama of his
Who were taking
yes, on whose decision he was taking the final decision that this decision is okay.
And that is why, Professor Aziz, some of the, especially European scholars, term this initiative of Akbar as Akbar wanted to become a pope. He wanted to be a king as well as the religious head. And was it the intention or it was some larger interest? Was it a personal interest that he wanted to be last word, or there was some larger scheme in that?
No, basically British historians they couldn't understand Islam, so they misinterpret these things so that those things could go in their favor. In Islam, Akbar can't dare to declare himself as Pope at all, and this was the highest position of Mustahid, and that was given by these 6 persons. But his own son disagreed with this measure, Abul Fazl, and that is why you will find the text of measure, reference of measure is there in Akbarnama, but the text of measure is missing from Akbarnama. Why? Because Abul Fazl differed with this measure, because in measure this authority is given by ulama to Akbar. Abul Fazl was of the view or the theory of kingship which he built up in Akbarnama, that God is giving this authority to Akbar. So there was some contradiction, conflict between Sheikh Mubarak and his son Abul Fazl. So he did not give the text of Meazarnama in Akbarnama, and he only gave some reference about Meazar.
So did this lead to Sulh-e-Kul or say what we call Deen-e-Ilahi? Did Akbar start a new religion also?
No.
Many scholars have said that he had started a new religion and he wanted to be a prophet sort of a...
But before that, you say that the text is not there in Akbarnama. So where do we get the text of Meazar?
In Abdul Qadir Badaini's Muntakhab al-Tarikh, he had given the full text of Meazarnama in Muntakhab al-Tarikh.
But Badayuni was a big critic of Akbar, so did he agree with that Meazar?
No. Whether he agreed or didn't agree, but he wanted to ridicule these 6 ulama that they have given this full authority of Islam to Akbar.
It was in sarcasm that he was...
Yes.
Can we get back to the question of Deen-e-Ilahi?
Basically it was not, Akbar was a very well-led person. He cannot think of inventing a new religion. Basically he wanted to propagate one silsila, an order, that's all. It has nothing to do with any religion, because Akbar was a very well-led. This mistake was committed by Alauddin Khilji, which was ridiculed by the ulama. But Akbar can't thought of inventing any religion, of becoming the prophet of any religion. He can't think. It was beyond his imagination. So it's a wrong interpretation.
And that is why Deen-e-Ilahi was never imposed on people.
Not at all.
It was a completely voluntary exercise.
Association sort of a thing, a voluntary.
Yes.
But then what is, in nutshell, is Sulh-e-Kul? We would like our students to know, because whenever Akbar's religious policy is discussed, Sulh-e-Kul comes. What is this Sulh-e-Kul concept? And I feel that was for the first time that any king had given that sort of a concept in Indian history.
The Sulh-e-Kul is basically is peace with all.
The
policy which was adopted by by Ashoka after Kalinga. So it was in the same spirit. Yes, that Mughal Empire will do peace with all. And in every case, in every corner, and that is why you will find that even Akbar exempted the Gav Charai, which was an important tax of the Mughal Empire, from the region of Vrindavan.
Oh, I see.
That the Gav Charai will be exempted in the region of
That
Vrindavan.
means if animals are being grazed on state land,
Yes,
then the tax was realized earlier
yes,
and Akbar abolished.
yes. Akbar abolished only from a pilgrim center.
Oh,
That shows that Akbar was realizing the importance of Vrindavan and the sentiments of Hindus which were attached with Vrindavan.
and
in any
especially
case,
with cow also.
yes.
That cow they were
Yes, yes.
domesticating as
Yes,
part
yes,
of their
yes,
religious
yes.
thing,
Yes.
and they should not be asked to pay a tax
Yes.
on their holy
Yes,
animals.
yes. And another ingredient of Sulekul was this popularization of education by Akbar, because only when you will educate people, only this Sulekul will prosper and will reach to other places. Today you are having Indira Gandhi Open University. Today you have covered whole India, but Akbar didn't have so much resources. So what Akbar did, that Akbar invented Madad-e-Maash grants, and Akbar asked ulama, both Hindu scholars and the Muslim scholars, that I will give you 200 bighas land, 300 bighas land in Vrindavan, in Amroha, in Jalali, in Badaयूं, and other towns. And the condition which he made, that you will have to live in those towns, and you will have to preach my policies in each and every town, and you will introduce these subjects, and he revised the syllabi of the madrasa.
This is very important.
Yes, up to first half of 16th century, there were two parts of the syllabi of the madrasas, manqulat and maqulat, subjects relating to religion and subjects relating to rational sciences. So during the first half of 16th century, religious element was 80% in the syllabi, 20% was rational sciences. Akbar reversed it from 1578, that 80%
Was rational?
syllabus will be based on
Oh, yes.
rational sciences, and 20%
20%
will be based on religious religious subjects. And that is why we find the ulama and the Sunni ulama and some of the Sufis like Sheikh Ahmad Sandi reacted sharply against this revision of the syllabi of the madrasa. So Akbar's policy of Sulekul basically reflected in the revision of the syllabi of the madrasa. He laid emphasis on rational sciences and not on religion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So it has been a very illuminating talk, and we wish we could have more time, but now time is running out and we are getting the signals to that time is over. So I would, for the present, close this discussion here as we saw, and what Professor Aziz discussed with us, that the cornerstone of Akbar's religious policy was tolerance, sulhul, and rationality was occupying one of the prominent places in all educational endeavors, and state was a tolerant and treating all subjects through one eye. Thank you so much for being with us. Professor Aziz, thank you so much for giving our students such illuminating
This was
discussion.
really very
Thank you,
interesting.
Professor Gavin.
Very